Edit this out, PR.
You're listening to the Art and War podcast with your hosts, Mitch and Nathan. Mitch is a former airborne infantry squad leader who now spends most of his time coaching soccer. Nathan is a professional illustrator and an avid shooter with a couple of years of Canadian military experience. Together, they run the Seaburn art page. Enjoy the show.
And welcome back to the Art and War podcast. Today we have Isaac very kindly helping co-host today.
Oh, I was not aware that I was helping co-host, but
oh, now you are.
Thanks for the heads up.
You're officially you are the official co-host now. You've taken over for Mitch.
I'll pipe down and let you continue with the
intros. We have Isaac Botkin from TREX Talks, and all the various TREX affiliated podcasts and everything. Now the new official co-host of the Art and War podcast, and we have Adam Kraut of the Second Amendment Foundation.
Hello. It's nice to see both of you.
Oh, well, thank you. It's nice to see you also. I had basically a paragraph about Isaac, but I don't have as much about you. You are like the lawyer man, a law person.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, I could fill in some of the blanks for you if that would be helpful.
That would be great. I would love that because I have seen you around the gun community for some time now, but I would love to find out what you have been up to, straight from the lawyer himself, as opposed to just hearsay and random internet rumors.
Yes, indeed.
It's sad that there's random internet rumors about me. So I am a lawyer, correct? I guess let me start at the beginning, right? I started practicing law in 2014. And as I did that, I was in private practice, and all I did was firearms-related stuff from the time I started practicing law. A little bit of game law thrown in there too, but mostly, firearm stuff, both individual and industry. I did that for about 5 years, and in 2019, I went to work for another nonprofit in this space for 3 years. August of last year, I departed that employment, and I started as the executive director of the Second Amendment Foundation on November 1st of last year. So that would have been 2022, if I have the years right. Still kind of trying to figure out what that number is, even though we're 3 months in now. So I've been the executive director here for the past almost 6 months, and it's been a very interesting role to step into, and it's certainly one that I never, there was no ambition to get here. It wasn't anything that I had charted out in my life's desires to do. Just one of those things where I was offered opportunity and said, what the hell, why not?
I actually truly believe the people who don't want any authoritative position, who are just kind of thrust into it, are generally the best.
Well, we're going to find out, right? Time's going to be the arbiter of that one.
Well, one of the things that is really fascinating to me is just, and I've talked about this, I will mention my own podcast. I'll plug my own podcast here. I talked about this a little bit on my podcast with a few different people. The culture, the firearm culture has changed to the point that we are no longer dependent on people outside of the gun community to be our lawyers and to be our journalists. Folks from inside of the gun community, people who have grown up around guns and familiar with guns and friendly with guns, are now actually going into some of these professions. And I think that it's had a huge benefit.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly, in looking around and seeing some of my peers, those that I work with, both in the legal community and then, those that are doing everything from small time media, like, a podcast such as this, or YouTube videos, to people that are in legit corporate media. There certainly does seem to be more people that have grown up in that world, in houses that had guns, and those that, said in households that looked at the Constitution and had a healthy respect for it, versus just kind of, casting aside things that they didn't like and saying, well, we should be able to change this because of, this new thing that's happening. It's a really interesting point. Like, I grew up in a house that didn't have guns. I learned to shoot guns in Boy Scouts, and I've told this story a number of times over the years, but I can remember I was about 12 years old. I was down at Camp Horseshoe in Rising Sun, Maryland. And I think I was taking rifle merit badge and got behind one of the Marlin 22s there. And I had this stupid grin that never left my face. And that was kind of the end of it for me. So, I turned 18. I bought a shotgun. My parents found out. They told me to get rid of it. I ultimately never did because I still have that shotgun. I turned 21, bought a handgun, got a carry permit. They saw that come in the mail and they were none too pleased. And one of the things I discovered, as time kind of went on, was that my parents' view of guns, and I could extrapolate this to the general population in a lot of ways, but my parents' view on guns was crafted by what they had read and what they had seen. They had no real experience with them. And at one point, I was, 23, somewhere in there. My dad asked me to take him shooting out of the blue. And his opinion on guns since then has morphed from being very anti-gun, why do you need this? There's no good that can come of it, to quite the opposite, actually. And it was through that experience, lending that real experience and exposure, that I think ultimately drove him to a different conclusion versus just consuming what media constantly put in front of him. So yeah, growing up with guns, not something I did. It was something that I kind of took upon myself, because guns are cool, man. Like, at the end of the day, even if you ignore all the constitutional aspects for a moment, like, guns are fun. There's a lot of fun things you can do with them. And then, as far as getting into practicing law and marrying guns, it was literally in a lot of ways a necessity. Because I was graduating law school and I needed an internship going into my last year, and I just so happened to see a local lawyer that had a practice in firearms related stuff, and I sent an email, hey, look, I really like guns as an interest, and oh, by the way, I'm in law school, and it would be really cool to kind of marry my interest with a career, because there's not really any kind of law that's appealing to me. And I kind of bumbled my way into an internship there, and here I am. So kind of worked out.
Yeah, no, it is really interesting to see. So what was it that took you from shooting 22s to further along? Like, how did you actually connect those dots and not just go from guns are fun, but I want to defend firearm freedom? I feel like 22s are great, but there's a pretty big step between enjoying shooting a 22 and wanting to defend firearm freedom as a job and a purpose and a calling.
Yeah, so I think it probably goes back to around when I was 21 and getting that, carry permit and a handgun. And my basis for doing that was looking at the news and kind of seeing how violent society was starting to get over trivial stuff, right? Not for good reason, but you stepped on somebody's shoe and you didn't apologize. The next thing you know, you're getting shot in the bar you're in because you disrespected somebody, or the local convenience store being robbed and things like that. And so in looking at it, it really occurred to me, and maybe this is just part of my upbringing and whatnot, but you really do have a personal responsibility for your own safety at the end of the day. And this was something that, was a thought when I was 21 years old. And so as we progressed through time, like I said, went to law school and kind of came out and just thought that I have an interest in guns. Politics had been a very big interest of mine when I was younger. I was a poli-sci major. I used to really enjoy the political arena, and now I really loathe it. But there was a time I really found it to kind of be fun and engaging. And I think it was kind of just marrying all of that stuff together and seeing that, how quickly rights can erode when political winds change. There's take your pick, right? Not a firearms related example, but you take 9/11, for instance. You get the Patriot Act soon after. And most people would say, well, the Patriot Act was a really good thing. But you look at what it did to a lot of freedoms, particularly in the surveillance world, and just how quickly you can apply it to any right, really. And just how quickly with, a tragic event, there's a knee-jerk reaction. And the next thing you know, you're left standing a little lower on the tower of your rights than you were, the day before. So I think that's kind of what really got me interested in it. And then as I started to practice law and see these different situations, I would talk to individuals that would call and say, look to see whether or not they could purchase a firearm. And, well, no, you're prohibited because of this, offense. And a lot of times, nonviolent misdemeanor, things like that, dealing with ATF and FFL compliance and regulatory stuff. So it was really kind of just seeing, I think, the world as it operates, plus some of my interests, and how quickly this can kind of go away, that really kind of just led me down this path. And I was very fortunate to have a very good mentor as well, who wanted me to be successful, and wasn't trying to just keep himself as the guy.
I find that really interesting, what you were mentioning, how the pipeline, and this is unrelated to politics, the pipeline of how you got interested in guns being something from Boy Scouts in a house that you really weren't allowed to play with guns or have anything to do with them. My upbringing was a little similar, and I think that's actually what kind of drove me towards it a bit. Boy Scouts, we shot air rifles, and cadets we eventually shot 22s and things like that. And the entire time my family was very against it, and I think that's part of why I developed the views I have today, at least put me on the way to that. Would you say that perhaps there's a little bit of a contrarian side that helped foster your interest?
Yeah, probably. I think it was just kind of, for me, the perfect storm of this is fun, and there is a utility behind this. And somebody a long time ago, a lot smarter than me, said, like, these are things that should be protected from the government being able to just say no more. And then particularly as I read and learned more about the idea of this natural right to self-defense, and that would extend to armed self-defense. And again, just kind of seeing how the world is, I think all that really just fostered and shaped my worldview on this, particularly this issue.
Yeah.
And ended up, where I am doing what I do.
Well, I'm glad that actually ended up working that way. It doesn't take a lot to that was kind of a crappy question in my regard. I didn't mean it to sound that bad, because inherently I really agree. Everyone has a right, say it comes from where you will, but a God-given right of self-defense, and the ability to defend yourself from other people, the government, anything. So yeah, that was a little crappy wording. I think
I wasn't going to say that, fellow host, but no.
But no, it absolutely was. I was genuinely just curious. It had nothing to do with because I very much stand, I think, where you do.
I would say that the same is true of me, even though my family was very gun friendly when I was growing up. The period of time that we lived in New Zealand, which is a very non-gun friendly country, as soon as we got back to America, and Texas no less, it was like, all right, time to make up for lost time.
Yeah.
It's funny, everybody holds Texas out as this like bastion of Second Amendment freedoms and awesomeness, and it's got some laws that you kind of look at and go, okay. I don't know. Yeah. Texans love Texas. I think that's ultimately at the end of the day what it is, and you just can't say anything bad about Texas, otherwise you're going to get a mob outside your door.
It's a huge hurdle, actually, because there's a bunch of people that I know in the Texas firearms freedom community who are like, hey, we should have these rights. And Texas politicians are like, nope, we're already perfect. Can't you see? It says Texas right here. We are the standard of what freedom is. And people are like, well, no, actually, like Vermont.
Yeah.
Don't bring Vermont up here. This is Texas. So that actually has been a hurdle there. And in Tennessee, to some extent, too, we have a Republican supermajority. We don't have quite the same level of state pride, but it's like, no, there's no chance anyone takes your guns away. So increasing freedoms is a very low on the priority list thing because we're already Republicans.
Yeah, so Pennsylvania's got an interesting mix. The county I live in particular, growing up, it used to be a very red county, like solid red. And over the years, we've watched it go from red to purple to now it's definitely blue, and is continuing to be that way. But if you look at Pennsylvania as a state, geographically, currently anyway, the way our legislature is made up, it's still red. Kind of barely at this point, but it's still red just because of the number of counties and seats and all that. But, I guess we had Corbett not terribly long ago, but if you look at all the statewide elected positions like governor, lieutenant governor, the attorney general, and things like that. So now our governor, unfortunately, is our former AG, who is very not freedom friendly, at least as it relates to firearms. And that's just something we're going to have to contend with. But laws getting passed here, one way or the other, it's not super clear which way it would go. I suspect, kind of as you were mentioning earlier, Isaac, before we started recording, that there may be the potential for some compromise on some things like red flag laws or something of that nature. But I don't think they're going to get anything, at least currently, through that's to one extreme or the other, for that matter.
Yeah, in some ways, that having a little bit of a it can be really helpful in some ways to have the conflict that is there, so that people stay sharp and actually defend what is theirs, and you can see some laziness come in without that. But obviously, there's the opportunity to compromise as well.
It's always a problem.
I've heard the phrase that, and what guys were saying about the when Republicans are in power, there's not really a focus on expanding rights. And we got into a little bit with Ben of the Gun Owners of America. I always want to say the Gun Owners Association. I'm just, again, being Canadian. He's a fantastic guy. And he actually brought me around on the idea of lobbying, which I don't want to say vehemently against, but I want to say, moreover, immaturely cynical about.
Mm-hmm.
But the importance of lobbying in terms of bringing politicians who don't really have an interest in a particular issue, in this case, firearm rights, into actually pushing legislation that would advance firearm rights forward. And I actually learned a lot about that, which is part of the reason I was so excited to bring you on.
Well, I think that's a really good segue, actually, because one of the things we were talking about, which we haven't gotten to yet, is what is the Second Amendment Foundation? And, unlike GOA, our work is not done in the state houses or the federal Capitol building. That's not really what we do. We're more in the court system, solidly in the court system. And I think maybe a little bit of history would be helpful to kind of tee up the conversation for where we are today, and then hopefully where we're going in the future. But Second Amendment Foundation was founded in 1974 by Alan Gottlieb, who's still around. He's our executive vice president. And at the time, the whole idea behind the purpose of SAF was how to elevate a case to the Supreme Court. Back then, you had one decision, I think it was in Oregon, dealing with the right to keep and bear arms, and actually dealt with knives. It wasn't even firearms. So you had one state level decision. And then you have the Miller decision at the Supreme Court, which dealt with short barrel shotguns. But really, there was nothing talking about the Second Amendment at the, especially in the federal court system. So in the early years, and also in 1974, it's worth mentioning, there was a law review article that for the first time advocated that the Second Amendment right was an individual right unconnected to militia service. So in the early years, SAF did a lot of education and a lot of funding of scholars in order to kind of build a foundation that would be necessary in order to elevate a case. Through the years, give the abridged version here. Through the years, there was a lot of publications that informed the public on the Second Amendment, either books, newsletters, this is what's going on in the world, things like that. We hit the 90s. There's a couple of lawsuits. You get the Brady bill in the early 90s, and SAF helped support some of the sheriffs who sued because the federal government was actually trying to co-opt the sheriffs and their resources into doing all this work for them without paying them to do it or giving them funding. So there was a couple of lawsuits, but really we hit our stride into the 2000s. The big lawsuit everybody knows is Heller, and let me just be very clear about this. If any gun group takes credit for Heller, they are lying. Heller was not funded by any of the gun groups. Alan Gurrow, the attorney who litigated that, received money from individual related to CATO. And of course, all the gun groups joined in on amicus stuff, but none of us funded that challenge. So you get Heller in 2008. And that confirms what everybody knew to be true, that you have a right to keep arms in your home, and that the Second Amendment protects that right, and it's unconnected to militia service. You get some other language in there that does talk about bearing arms, although the courts, after the fact, seemingly ignore any of that. And you also get some stuff as to the types of firearms that are protected. 2010, you get McDonald versus City of Chicago, which was a SAF case. Just want to put that out there. That was a Second Amendment Foundation case. And that incorporated the Second Amendment against the states via the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Put in English, that means that if the states or a municipality like the city you live in violated the Second Amendment, that would be a problem for them because it now applies to them as well, not just the federal government. In 2016, you get CATO, which confirmed that items not in existence at the time of the founding are protected by the Second Amendment. In this case, it was stun guns, and there was language in there about bearable arms. Good to know, right? And now we get Bruen last year, and Bruen says you have a right to bear arms outside of the home. And it reiterated the test that was put forth in Heller, which was the text of the Second Amendment as informed by this nation's history and tradition. There were a couple other useful tidbits that came out of Bruen, but Bruen really just said, like, we already told you in Heller what the analysis for all this is, and for the last, Heller was 2008, so 10 years or so, you guys have been doing this wrong, so stop doing it wrong, and yes, there's a right to bear arms outside the house. And that puts us where we are today. So up until today, we've been involved in over 250 cases, either as a plaintiff funding a challenge where it wasn't appropriate for us to be a plaintiff, or an amicus briefing. And when I checked last week, I think we have 43 active cases, 42 which are federal and one of which is state. So we are very busy, and the court system is certainly our bread and butter.
That's incredible.
Well, it's fantastic that you guys have some better tools with all of those rulings. And that is really a fascinating thing. Can I ask a historical question? Why
Please.
is it that it took us a while to get back to what I think is like a really plain, obvious originalist reading of the Second Amendment? Because in my childhood and the time before, all of that was kind of lost. And even this basic idea that the Second Amendment is an individual right and not a collective militia apparatus, that just seems like a very fascinating story of how that was lost, that really basic understanding.
I don't have a good answer for you on that, Isaac. I've never actually thought to ask that question. If I had to venture a guess, and this is going to be as uneducated as they come, I just want to be clear on that point. It probably has to do with a lot of the same things that the remainder of the constitutional rights, or Constitution in general, is. The further in time you get away from when it was adopted, the less relevant it seemingly is to you. So, of course, right after the Revolutionary War, there's this sense of, okay, we need to be able to protect ourselves from a tyrannical government or a tyrant themselves. And in order to do that, we need to be able to bear arms. And of course, back then you also had all the founding fathers who were very well read. They understood that there was this, natural right to self-defense. But as we get further away in time from when these things were adopted, the understanding of why, particularly if it's not passed on generation to generation, tends to dissolve. And then what you're left with is a bunch of people going, well, yeah, it's in there, but that seems kind of archaic, doesn't it? That would be my best guess. And again, it's an uneducated one.
That complacency. Yeah.
It's something that I always seem to point to. The best example I can think of is I recall myself growing up, and this is anecdotal, but the access to information that we had was all, state television. We had CNN, Fox, here we have CBC, NBC, all of that stuff. All of the information that we had access to was drip fed. Everything was within a very narrow Overton window of what was acceptable and what wasn't. Any interpretation of, the Second Amendment or anything, the example I could always point to would be, the war in Iraq was very curated, and there wasn't a lot of discourse about it. The sort of things that, for example, with the Second Amendment, you could point at the Federalist Papers or any historical documents that actually analyze and reaffirm what the actual intention was. That wasn't really common knowledge.
Well, you raised an interesting point that maybe I can chime in on. So
yeah, please.
You talk about the curated content. Certainly, content's always curated when it's coming from a media source. But I think over the last, couple years, probably since Heller, particularly since Heller, you've had a lot of research being done original research being done into, the time of the founding and the understanding of the scope of the right then, things that, would be relevant for this test that the Supreme Court spelled out. But absent that, a lot of that, I think, was lost to the pages of history until people started digging, because now they realize that this is relevant to this kind of, at least, litigation. And the other point you made that I think is worth discussing is there isn't really public discourse on things. It's a lot of I'm right, you're wrong, and that's it. Nobody wants to engage in a conversation where maybe at the end of it they say, you know what, hey, I was wrong, or my view, let me consider what you have to put forward, and maybe you are correct on it. It's just very much I'm right, you're wrong, end of conversation. And I think particularly when we're having that discourse with people who hold an opposing viewpoint, if you look at the reasons for their viewpoint, a lot of times it's based on emotion. And there's no reasoning with emotions. And I've said this a number of times in the past, right? You have logic versus emotion, and those are just two different languages. They're not compatible with one another. So you could present all the statistics, you could present the history, the rationale behind why something is the way it is or should be the way it is, and you'll just get back, well, I feel unsafe, I feel sad, or whatever the emotional response is. And you can't reason that away. That's just something somebody will have to work through the emotional aspect and then make the decision to look at it from a logical perspective. You want to go down this road, we could talk about assault weapons, so-called assault weapons, right? You look at the FBI statistics on it and the amount of times that they're actually used in a crime versus, handguns certainly more, but you choose something more innocuous, baseball bat, hammer, things like that. Those are used more in crimes than these types of rifles, yet it elicits such an emotional response because of the events that they tend to be used in. And there you go, right? Logic would dictate this isn't really the problem that you think it is, but the emotional response is this was horrible. We need to do something.
Yeah, and you can definitely see that. I'm thinking back to when I was a kid and the war on drugs was happening and Clinton assault weapons ban came into effect. There was part of it goes back to that curated information. There was very much a focus on specific crimes and specific events, and then a very emotional response to those things. So you mentioned that the Second Amendment Foundation started back in the mid-'70s. Like, when did some of this rediscovery and scholarship really start to happen?
So it was in the 70s where that idea kind of culminated, and there was a concerted effort to actually gather these scholars and start to look at the history, because again, we're looking to build the foundation of what we need, the information we need in order to get a case to the Supreme Court. So there was a lot of scholars that got together around that time. They weren't, just to be transparent about everything, they weren't entirely funded only by SAF. Other groups did do it as well. And in the early years, they actually had invited some individuals who had opposing viewpoints to come and kind of like peer review their work. Little did they know that they were peer reviewing it and kind of helping us find weaknesses in our arguments so we could go bolster it. But, fun fact. But that's, kind of when that all started, that look to that stuff. And, not a time period I was around for, obviously. I'm a little younger than that. But some of those guys are still around, actually. They've written a number of books over the years. Some of them are college professors or were college professors, and even law school professors. But we do, I do occasionally get to be in the same room as them. We hold an event every year called Gun Rights Policy Conference, which is, I think this is the 38th year it's going to be. And they all, continuously come to it. But back in the day, prior to the advent of the internet, Gun Rights Policy Conference was a place where everybody would get together and they would brainstorm these ideas and how to do things. Being in the same room, that networking that you can now do through Facebook and other things way easier.
Yeah, there was a bunch of stuff that I can sort of around that same time. It felt like there was a lot of stuff in the late 70s. Sort of homeschooling came back. There were a number of different little movements that started to move towards freedom in different areas, and they started off small, and people scoffed at them. And now it's really interesting to see how prevalent some of those ideas, some of those crackpot ideas were, and we see them even being upheld by the Supreme Court.
It certainly is fascinating, and it is interesting to see people kind of, in any number of ways, taking back bits and pieces of control over their lives.
This week's episode is brought to you by returning sponsor of the Art and War podcast, FieldSeeds.com. FieldSeeds.com is an e-commerce federally licensed firearms dealer. They provide virtual reviews on brand new firearms, optics, and gear, where at the end of the review, you are automatically entered with purchase of a review to win the item being reviewed.
Currently, they've got reviews up from $20 for a brand new Smith & Wesson M&P Shield 2.0 to $60 for a brand new Trigicon ACOG with an RMR on it. Each review has limited seating, so your chances of winning the giveaway are that much higher. I have to lean into it. I have to. It's a pun.
God. Check out fieldseeds.com to purchase your review and enter to win the item being reviewed. And use code CBRN, that's Charlie Bravo Romeo November, to get 10% off your order.
Be sure to also check out their Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube @field_seats for updates on the products and other tips and info like how to pack a ruck or how to gas your rifle.
Once again, use code CBRN to receive 10% off your entire purchase at fieldseeds.com. Terms and conditions apply. How's it going, lads and ladies? BR and Nathan here to take a quick break to tell you about our Patreon. Not only do we want to continue improving the quality of what we can do here on Art and War, but we want to push what we do all over at Seaburn Art, from the guides to pursuing video content and keeping us warm during another winter of illness and death, and the Patreon helps us get after it.
But what's in it for you? Our Patreon subscribers enjoy 5 different tiers of exclusive perks, ranging from all the content we'd post on a pre-Zuckerberg Instagram, downloadable high-resolution guides, targets such as Redcoat Skinwalkers, John Harvey Kellogg, seasonal targets, and more. Behind-the-scenes info like my personal art, introducing all new exclusive mini-podcast episodes, and at our highest tier, get monthly art commissions created by yours truly.
You can find our Patreon via the link in this episode's description, at patreon.com/SeaburnArt, or in the Seaburn Art page's bio on Instagram. Thanks for listening. Now let's get back to the show.
I like that, and I don't want to attribute all of that to social media or the internet or anything like that, but I think that's a huge part of it. I genuinely do. I think the push towards more self-sufficiency and the distrust in government is really being fostered by the ability to freely speak on the internet, to be able to share ideas and to get people to think about things. Because the truths seem, as you were kind of saying earlier, fairly obvious and kind of self-evident, but unless you kind of spark that idea to begin with, most people won't even consider it.
If you also just look at the access to information too, I suspect that probably goes hand in hand with what you're saying, right? Now I can just pop on YouTube, and if I want to be a homesteader, I could probably learn a good chunk of what I need to know from watching YouTube videos of somebody recording. This is how you do this. You want to raise chickens. Here's how you build the coop. Here's how you build the pen. These are the things you need to do. Stuff that you would have, the barrier to access the information would have been a lot greater, and it, would have been scattered in different places as well. So I think that's part of it.
Absolutely. I've been looking into homeschooling curriculums, and there's so much available online. It's wonderful. I can't imagine that, 10, 20 years ago. Perhaps it existed, but I imagine the barrier for entry, as you were saying, would be much, much higher.
Oh, it was really interesting. So my parents, I am very old, and so my parents began homeschooling me when it was fairly new, but it was legal in the state where we were. But there were legal battles in Texas. Again, Texas thinking it is so free, but homeschooling was outlawed in Texas. I forget when it was actually legalized. And up in the Nebraska area as well, there were some really important landmark cases to even get homeschooling legalized in certain states that you would assume would be free. And so the stigma was still there when I was a kid. And we pretty much homeschooled with no curriculum, basically with books that we could get from the library, because it was pre-internet and it was pre prepackaged curriculum. So as I got older, there were more curriculum, prepackaged curriculums available. But yeah, it was really fascinating to see that sort of grow up out of nothing, and now it's an industry. And COVID lockdowns were very good for the homeschooling industry, actually.
Yeah, I know a number of people that switched to homeschooling during COVID for any number of reasons. So it has been interesting to kind of see all of that. And again, I think the barrier to access information pre-internet is a lot higher than what it currently is. I mean, take anything you want to learn about. For instance, I wanted to see when Texas made homeschool legal, and it looks like, according to Google, it was 1994.
Really? that
interesting.
Is a lot.
That may be a weird technicality, because I know friends that were doing it back then without going to jail.
They might have been breaking the law, just not getting caught.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. And there's also an aspect, information obviously is huge, but there's a relational aspect to it as well. And so I think that there is a level of, I don't know what the right term is, but basically familiarization. And it takes time for this idea to permeate, even when the information is there. And I can think of a bunch of things, like a lot of homeschoolers were really pro school choice back in the day. And school choice is not really an idea that got momentum until fairly recently. So the information is extremely important, but sometimes I feel like it just takes time for an idea to grow and get traction and spread, and people have time to really flesh it out. And as you pointed out, shore it up and deal with the weaknesses. And all of that happens much faster when the information can be freely available. But eventually that snowball has some momentum to it and is just moving.
Isaac, not to out myself for apparently being uncultured, what do you mean by the school choice movement?
So in the United States, we have public schools that are government schools, and it is really, really hard to get any of that money that the government takes away from you back, even if your kids are not in the public school system. And so there have been a lot of weird ideas related to vouchers. Like if you have paid your taxes to educate your kids, but you're not putting them in public school, can charter schools have access to that money, or private schools? Can homeschoolers have access to that money? All these ideas have been thrown around for a while, and different people have tinkered with different systems. But the school choice movement, and Adam, you probably are paying closer attention to this than I am, but the school choice movement really has been kind of the big groundswell movement since COVID. I think a lot of parents got to see just how messed up their school boards and teachers unions were in 2020. And they were like, we paid you how much money to be closed for how long? Yeah. Let's have some school choice. Let's get some of that money out and give it to people that want alternatives.
I like that. I actually didn't know anything about it. And I find that interesting, because that is something you would imagine would be more popular in terms of being in mass media or anything other than the where we see it.
Yeah, it's kind of a crazy it's kind of a crazy thing, because it is in Europe. There's all sorts of subsidies for these sorts of things, and in America it's just been like, nope, our teachers deserve more money. Public school is where it's at. And personally, I have mixed feelings about vouchers. I don't like the fact that the government is taking the money away and then giving it back if they like the school that I pick. I have a slightly different model that I would prefer. But even though this hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention in the press, it was a pretty big deal in the last elections. Like, there was not exactly a red wave, but there was absolutely a school choice wave when it came to individual local politicians.
Yeah. That sound. I'm sorry, Adam. This is a homeschooling podcast now.
It's okay. I'm not an expert on homeschooling.
No, I actually find this really fascinating. Something I've talked about briefly on a previous episode was one of the worst things I think has been happening to public schooling, which I'm going to homeschool. I hope that more people homeschool. But the qualifications that it takes to become a teacher, I'm not quite sure what it is, and I imagine it varies state by state for most of the United States. But here, generally through basically this entire country, you need the equivalent of a master's level degree. And I've seen people go into that program and come out basically the picture of the establishment monster that are getting exposed on, YouTube videos for doing terrible things to children. And they go into that program fairly normal, and they come out advocating all sorts of really weird and wild things. I think it's tinfoil hat on for a second by design. I do think the academic machine is there for a reason. It's to bring people around a certain level of politics.
Interesting. That sounds a little conspiratorial there. It's almost as if like these people that have boards that they use to maintain the control of their organizations might be conspiring together in their board meetings. That's weird.
Oh,
This is
that
now
would
the
never
Art
happen.
of Conspiracy podcast.
Oh, that's just me. That's just me. Then maybe that's just up here in the Great White North. But either way,
I think Jordan Peterson may have commented on this at some point. If only he were, a trustworthy source instead of a hateful bigot, maybe we could learn more. I heard he can't be trusted because he's just the worst person on earth since Hitler, or possibly ever.
I remember I have some friends, just normal people that I've gone to school. One of them I went to Boy Scouts with, and they've heard the podcast. I try and keep it out of my day-to-day life, but they messaged me and went, "Oh, you must be a big fan of Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan," and I don't think I've ever been more offended.
So while we're on the topic of Jordan Peterson, I think he's another example of ideas whose time have come, because it's not like the stuff that he's talking about is particularly revolutionary.
Yeah.
Most of it's very historical.
Yes.
But a lot of the stuff that he has been talking about, people have been talking about this for decades with no, real traction or momentum. But the timing is just right. And I'm even just thinking of little things. Like I heard him in a clip a while back talking about the Frankfurt School. Speaking of academia and the conspirators that came over to kind of mess with their educational system, this is something my dad researched a lot back in the 80s and early 90s. And he talked about the Frankfurt School educators, and people treated him like he was this insane nutcase. But now it's a thing that there's good scholarship on it. Everyone knows about this. Even guys like Jordan Peterson, who's a psychiatrist, like, oh yeah, this is exactly how education works. No, he goes, oh yeah, that's exactly how education works up in the system. Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. It sometimes just takes time for these, I think, for the ideas to really sink in, and people to spend the time to actually work through the either the research or the implications of them.
I am so sorry, Adam. I'm really enjoying this. We haven't gotten to homeschooling in a little while, and it's kind of, but it's something that innately fascinates me, and it kind of ties into everything else. Just the idea of individual freedoms, and getting off the teat of the government.
Yeah.
I want to say.
Yeah, and that's that is I think a really good segue, because the way the homeschooling movement got started in a lot of places was there were people complaining to their school boards about this and complaining to their teachers about that. And it wasn't until a few people were like, look, we're just going to do this thing and go ahead and arrest us. Now we have standing and we're going to fight back. And I feel like that is where a lot of gun rights are, where we have asked for this and asked for that. And in certain jurisdictions, there's been a lot of value in political lobbying, but there's going to be some people who are just like, look, this is blatantly unconstitutional. It needs to go to court. I'm going to do it, and then I'm going to have standing and sue you. And I feel like there are people that have the backbone to do that, and they've seen that that is actually a path forward that can work. And I feel like that's where we're at with a whole bunch of different things.
The good news is, in constitutional challenges, you don't have to do the thing that's illegal. You can bring pre-enforcement challenges so that you're not putting yourself in legal jeopardy. So, and that's a lot of times that's exactly what our plaintiffs, the position that they're in. I would engage in this activity or conduct, but for this law that now makes it illegal, and the punishment is I get to go sit in a 10 by 10 cell for the next 10 years and lose all my rights in the process. So. it's a good segue into like the whole plaintiff thing. Finding people to be parties to this lawsuit is no small feat a lot of times. You need somebody who's willing to put their name out there in public, which in and of itself, removing everything else from the table, that's a pretty big ask. And then to go up and tell the government essentially, hey, screw you, bigger ask a lot of times. So it's finding plaintiffs is something that we're always looking for when we're looking to bring a case. We've been very fortunate in that SAF has taken a position prior to me coming here, and it's one that I tried to do at my former employer, and that I absolutely intend to continue doing here. But building good relationships, and that includes a lot of state groups. So we're very fortunate in the sense of we have close relationships with a lot of state groups through various states, and when we're going to litigate a case in that state, we call them up and say, hey, this is what we want to do, or they contact us and say, we'll find the plaintiffs for you. And cool, you get to come along, join us in the action. We would love to have you. We can all share the credit. Doesn't really matter to us. If you guys say you're out there doing it because you're helping, likewise, we're helping too. The plaintiffs that have been the hardest have been the 18 to 20 year olds, and it's a really fascinating kind of area. I think post Parkland in Florida, that's I think really kind of when you started to see a lot of these laws being passed that directly impact 18 to 20 year olds, both from being able to purchase, and then a lot of times there were already laws on the books that just kind of prevented them from applying for carry permits because it said you got to be over 21 in order to do so. So we have a number of different cases that are dealing with that, but that particular age group, for whatever reason, and I'm in my mid 30s. I'm not super old, but like I can't get them to pick up the phone. They don't even respond to text messages half the time anymore. So that group, when we're looking for 18 to 20 stuff, that's hard. And the other big time, yeah, I mean, really, I was kind of thinking like maybe I just need to hire somebody to do a dance on TikTok or whatever else, and get these people like send a dance back. I don't know. I don't even know how that works, but
the firearm freedom dance. It's a new type of legal scholarship we didn't know we needed.
Yeah. But getting them to be responsive is difficult. And then the other problem we run into with them is because litigation takes so long, a lot of times by the time it's up on appeal, they've already aged out or they're about to age out. So it's finding the next group to sub in as like, hey, look, this is still a problem. Yeah. And yes, our person reached the age where they could engage in whatever the conduct they couldn't was, but these people are still affected. And this is one of those ongoing things that just, it's going to continue. Just this particular individual doesn't have standing anymore because they're no longer affected by it.
Yeah. Can you theoretically switch plaintiffs out if they age out?
You can sub in new ones, yeah. So there's a case that was in the Fourth Circuit, and I forget the name of it. You'll have to forgive me on that point, but it was an 18 to 20 case, and they got up on appeal in the Fourth Circuit, and they didn't substitute in a younger plaintiff in time, and the Fourth Circuit said, too bad, so sad, even though that like they had identified somebody else they could have subbed in. I think it was Hirschfeld. I think that's the name of the case, if memory serves correct. But yeah, you can, and that's actually something we're looking to do right now in a couple of our cases is add some additional plaintiffs who are around that 18-year age, preferably, so that they have a little bit of time. But I think our Pennsylvania 18 to 20 carry case is one, and there's one or two other purchase ones. I'd have to go back and see what the attorneys told me which cases they were. But I think there was 3 or 4 that we're looking to start doing that sooner rather than later.
Interesting. We had a very interesting. This exact same lawsuit, Firearm Policy Coalition ran in Tennessee about 18-year-old carry. And we had an interesting thing happen, which was we got a new attorney general mid-proceedings, and he actually settled. He said, Tennessee and the Department of Public Safety are actually going to settle. The judge is going to write out, exactly what the settlement requirements are. And he got a lot of pushback from the press who were like, why on earth did you give up? And he was like, well, the Bruen decision got handed down and all the other states are losing their cases, and we just did this thing. And that's interesting.
Yeah. So I was around for that case when it was filed. So I think it was Bassett versus Slatery, if I remember remember the name of it, but yeah, it was
Yeah.
18 to 20 carry case. There's a few of them going on around the country, and the governments that are clinging to this position of that they can regulate that conduct. I mean, really, you're talking about a legal. It's been interesting to see the briefing on it, actually, because if you look at a lot of the arguments that the government are making, well, at the time of the founding, 18-year-olds were minors because at the age, a majority was 21 back then, but that's not the case anymore. When you turn 18, you're an emancipated adult. So
Yeah.
you're cherry picking the age aspect versus like the legal reality of they're no longer children. And then you're really kind of discriminating against them. Well, you are discriminating against legal adults for a certain threshold age that they can't exercise their constitutional right in full. It's like, here, have a little bit of it, just a small taste, but you can't do these other things. It'd be like taking your First Amendment right and saying you can write whatever you want as long as it's on pen and paper, but the internet, not till you're 21. Something. It's a stupid example, but something along those lines. So
I have considered that for my own children, but I'm not the government. I'm a dad, so it's a little different.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the 18 to 20 cases are really interesting. The other ones that I really enjoyed in my time in private practice, and I'm curious to see kind of how these transpire as we continue to go on, were the prohibited persons cases. Those individuals who were convicted of nonviolent offenses, both felonies and misdemeanors. We had a case in the Third Circuit that was litigated by the same attorney that was responsible for Heller, and these were funded by the Second Amendment Foundation. And it was an individual who had been charged, and I think he pled guilty or was convicted, I can't remember which, of corruption of a minor. He had a consensual relationship with a 17-year-old girl, and there was another individual who was convicted of carrying a firearm without a license in Maryland. And these went up on appeal in the Third Circuit, and the Third Circuit came back like 2016, I want to say, and said, yeah, as applied, this prohibition is unconstitutional as to these individuals. And it opened up the door to these as applied challenges. So in my time in private practice, we brought several of them. One's still up on appeal, actually, in the Third Circuit. Two went up to cert on the Supreme Court, and cert was denied. And there was another one. This was the stupidest one. Gentleman had been convicted of an offense for forging a window tint exception here in Pennsylvania. He had gotten one. He bought a new vehicle, which was the same make and model, just a different year. And rather than going back and seeking the exception, he just changed it. He ended up getting caught and prosecuted for it. And this was a misdemeanor of the first degree. So it was punishable by more than 5 years imprisonment. Didn't serve any time. So that was one we won at trial, and the government just walked away from that one. The other two, including the one that's up on appeal, were both DUIs, misdemeanors of the first degree, and the woman who had submitted a false statement on her tax return, which was a federal felony. So they kind of they warped the test from the Binderup case, the original case, through a couple of these other ones, and it'll be interesting to see post Bruen, if this shifts back now. But those cases, I enjoyed those cases because it strikes me that it's incredibly stupid to prohibit somebody for the rest of their life from being able to possess firearms and ammunition for anything, including self-defense, when they're convicted of a nonviolent crime. It doesn't sit well with me at all. So I was always a big fan of those cases, but I'm hoping that we can do some more of them in the future, finding the right plaintiff to be the vehicle for chipping away at that infringement there.
Yeah. That actually reminds me of red flag laws. If red flag laws were to be challenged in a judicial way, would that require that somebody's firearms had actually been taken away in order for them to have standing, or could you make the argument that the jeopardy that you are in is sufficient?
I would think that in that case, they would actually need to be confiscated because I guess everybody could say they're in jeopardy, but are you actually in jeopardy? If there's serious threats, but the problem with it, and this is something that I think, has kind of been considered, which is why I don't think you've seen anybody challenge the constitutionality of them, is that you are given due process. Now, when I say you're given due process, it's not the due process I would like to see. The Supreme Court has said that a post-deprivation hearing is due process. So it doesn't mean that you get your deprivation. You don't.
Gotcha,
It doesn't mean. And this is really where the problem is. I would think, in my personal opinion, that if you're going to be deprived of a constitutional right, you should get your hearing before you're deprived of your constitutional right, regardless of which right it is. Unfortunately, the way the case law has shaken out is that as long as you're given a timely hearing post-deprivation, that's considered due process. And if you look at the way that these laws are crafted, they're usually within a 2-week period. So you have your ex parte hearing up front, which means that you, the person accused, are not present for. And usually I think it's within 2 weeks, you get to show up and have your hearing where you get to present your side of the story and evidence. So unfortunately, I don't think that those are ripe for challenge in that particular, like the due process context, because the Supreme Court has said like post-deprivation hearings are okay. Sucks, but the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Something I found really, you brought this up earlier, the case specifically regarding stun guns and what set the judicial precedent for common use. And I believe if I read it correctly, 200,000 stun guns were in circulation, and that is what constituted common use for this particular arm to be covered by the Second Amendment. Perhaps I'm just being needlessly optimistic, but I feel like that could apply to a lot of things, and including stocks on short barrel rifles, as braces have now been deemed a stock by the ATF. Suppressors, short barrel, all sorts of things. Do you have any input on that?
Yeah, so the numbers, I wouldn't read too much into the numbers, right? Like the Supreme Court certainly did not set a floor of you need this many and then we consider it common use. The other thing to consider is that the Supreme Court has said that arms that are dangerous and unusual may be banned or regulated, rather. It's a conjunctive test, right? It's got to be dangerous and unusual. The government, in a lot of cases, both state and federal, has argued in cases, particularly with assault weapons, is the prime example that these are dangerous, and they have to be dangerous, not and unusual, or they might say, oh, it's unusual, and it's got to be unusually dangerous, right? Like all firearms are inherently dangerous. Their whole purpose is to kill something, regardless of whether it's like at the end of the day. That's what it is. It's stupid to argue otherwise. So it's a conjunctive test, dangerous and unusual. I think as it relates to the NFA, personal opinion, you're a long way from seeing anything happen with that. Here's why. Today, as we're sitting here, we have, we, as in SAF, I think we have 5, maybe 6 assault weapons ban cases currently. And we have, I think, 3 or 4 magazine capacity cases. Maybe I might be off on that number. It might be 1 or 2 more. We have yet to have a court, a circuit court en banc, uphold or strike down any of these restrictions as unconstitutional. Every time a panel has found them to be unconstitutional, it's gone en banc, which means it's heard by the court as a whole versus a 3-judge panel. And every time the court as a whole has said that, no, this restriction is constitutional. So I think currently, with the way things are, your odds of getting short barrel rifles, machine guns, silencers, those regulations found to be unconstitutional is not very likely when you don't even have 30-round magazines being said to be constitutionally protected by courts, the circuit courts as a whole. Of course, the Supreme Court hasn't weighed in yet. If you were to ask me personal opinion as to the trajectory of where things are going, well, again, Heller, you have right to bear arms or keep arms in your home. It does mention bear as well. You get CATO, you get Bruen that says you have a right to bear arms outside the home. So, and Heller also talks about like the types of firearms. But I think the next logical step, if we're looking at this from a progressive standpoint, would be what kind of arms are protected by the Second Amendment, right? I think that would be the next logical progression for the Supreme Court to take up. Whether they do that or not, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. Guessing what the Supreme Court's going to do is not something I'm willing to engage in. But I would think from a logical progression, that would be a likely next step.
Interesting. Yeah. How do you think that would go? Would that, just based on their last few rulings, I would be very optimistic that they would give us a really good test, a really good precedent. But what would your thought be?
Well, I would tell you, look at everything that's in our briefing, and I'll give you a summation of it because I'm not going to ask you to read it and then recount it to me. But you look at the briefing that we have done on this issue, and you have one that these types of firearms and even magazines are in common use for lawful purposes. There's no question about it. There's only a handful of states that outlaw this stuff in any form or fashion. So I think that's step one, right? Is it in common use for lawful purposes? Well, the answer here is yes. If you look at the history and tradition, and you look to see what laws the government's citing to try to justify their regulations, they're grasping at straws. When they say, well, these couldn't have been contemplated by the founding fathers. There were firearms back then that had the capacity of more than 10 rounds that were repeating arms.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't an unheard of thing that aliens came down from the sky and said, "Here, check this out," right? Like they already had the technology in some form or fashion. So there, again, if you go back and look at the test, and the test is text of the Second Amendment. So the text of the Second Amendment says you have a right to keep and bear arms. So inherently, you would have a right to keep these arms and bear them. And then the court says, well, okay, if it's seemingly protected by the text, government's turn. Go justify the restriction based on history and tradition. And that has to be either an exact replica or, law that was in existence at the time, or an analogous one that you can reasonably import into today's restrictions. So you can't go and pick something and, through a bunch of loops and turns somehow arrive, but it's got to be reasonably analogous to it. And the last point is it can't be an outlier. So if you found one jurisdiction around the time of the founding that did this exact conduct, but nothing else existed, you're not going to be able to hang your hat on that. So I think if you were asking me, if you're looking at the text of the Second Amendment as informed by the nation's history and tradition, that, these laws should be easily struck down. Now, we'll see what kind of mental gymnastics may come up where courts try to, walk away from that. But that's my guess.
This episode was brought to you by AWS, Advanced Warfighting Solutions.
We use the out of their gear here at On War.
Everything's made in North Carolina, and they make everything.
Everything.
I'm a big fan of their SMU war belt, the snack pack, their assault pack, their plate carrier, kind of a big fan of everything. And they've been around for a long time with a lot of hard use kit.
Overseas and here at home.
Sorry, I'm just reattaching my phone. Sorry, it'd come loose. This is my fidget spinner, okay?
I know. AWS is our longest running sponsor, and they've helped us do a little bit of everything here at On War, from keeping the guides coming out by providing Nathan a new iPad, as well as chucking gear our way so we can get out there on the range.
Tough as hell gear so they can help us go LARP in the woods.
Yep, my assault pack comes out with me every time I'm in the woods. If you want to pick up a one-and-done Molly pistol belt, look no further than the AWS SMU belt. Use code ONWAR10 for $10 off. We get no kickbacks, you just save money. Link to their site down in the description and in the Seaburn art page's bio. Thanks for listening. Now let's get back to the show.
I think one of my favorite things is seeing the new Bruen challenges and seeing the state try and defend themselves by citing incredibly antiquated racist laws. Mostly, a free slave cannot do this. We are, putting... It is hilarious to, especially that's happened a couple of times in California.
Well, it's interesting. There is a current case that I was reading about, a Delaware case, because Delaware has an assault weapons ban, and apparently that was recently upheld by a federal judge.
Preliminary I'll cut you
preliminary,
off.
yeah,
Yeah, the preliminary
yeah.
injunction was denied on that.
So it's a very interesting thing where he made the case that, well, even though you have cartridge boxes and you have ways of carrying large amounts of ammo at the time, because they didn't connect directly to the rifle like a detachable box magazine, then this is a 100% completely different thing. And that is interesting.
Yeah, that case, if you read the opinion, the judge definitely, there were parts where, you know, he understands the logic the plaintiffs, Saf is one of them, put forth and agrees with a lot of it, but found a way to arrive at the conclusion that, okay, at least for the preliminary injunction purposes, not so sure you're going to prevail on the merits here. Whether it's, the judge just doesn't want to put his signature on something that says, okay, these things are fine or not, I
Right.
don't know. But he found a way to get to the result that doesn't allow that today anyway.
Interesting. Yeah. So I was a witness in not a case, but a hearing. The Oregon magazine ban. Gun Owners of America was running one of the lawsuits, and I got to. Oh, it's such. Well, I mean, it was a privilege, but it was also completely no fun to be a witness. I should
don't you love
clarify.
bureaucracy?
Well, it was. I've never been cross-examined before, and it was just odd doing it over Zoom because the way the cameras were set up, I could see the judge watching the opposing counsel, but I couldn't see them. So it was this weird, like I was second person. I had a second person view of the proceedings being cross-examined. But this was, it was a similar thing. They were focusing very much on what actual firearms existed at the time that Oregon became a state, and whether or not they held 10 rounds or whether or not anybody in Oregon could have thought of that. And it felt very much like straining at gnats. And it was like, people probably didn't know that guns could hold more bullets. And I didn't say this, but like Jules Verne was writing books about guys with repeating rifles shooting electric bullets underwater. Like, people had imaginations back then. They wanted guns that were more powerful. They always have.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting point you brought up about the strained arguments that are being articulated by the governments in these cases, because they are strained, very much so. A lot of them are not grounded in anything that you would look at and say, okay, reasonable argument there. It's a lot of grasping at straws. Mark Smith, who runs Four Boxes Diner on YouTube, he's a Second Amendment scholar. I was talking to him the other day. He seems to think that since Bruen, there have been more Second Amendment, positive Second Amendment decisions than in the last 12 years. And what's been kind of fascinating to see is if you look at a lot of these decisions that are coming out, I mean, it shouldn't be fascinating, right? This is the way the law should be. But you're seeing judges that were appointed by Democrats that are coming out and finding, that, this is unconstitutional. And unfortunately, like, it's sad you even have to look at who appointed them to figure out whether or not you have a good chance in front of that judge, or wow, that's a surprise that judge wrote that opinion. But even judges that would potentially be more hostile or under the old test, find any way to explain that away as, the government's got a rational interest in this. Good to go. That they're even finding that these laws are unconstitutional in a lot of ways. So I think a lot of the laws that are out there, assuming that the courts stay true to the test that was put in front of them by the Supreme Court for yet another time, I think a lot of them you're going to see results where they are found to be unconstitutional. It really has. I don't want to say it's opened the floodgates, because, again, if you read Heller and what Heller said the test was, had the courts been doing this the entire time, we wouldn't be doing a lot of this right now, because it would have been done years ago.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
In your experience, because I know that it many times feels like we're against this completely unassailable wall of progressivism, liberalism, and the system is corrupt. But when you actually have the tests, and when you actually do the scholarship, and when lawyers actually present the case, and it's a strong case, how often do it seems like we've gotten a lot of really good decisions, more than in the last 12 years. It seems like if that is done, if you present a really strong case, judges do actually rule according to the outline that they've been given, according to the precedent that they have.
You would hope that that's the case, and a lot of times it is. But there are times where judges want to find a way to reach the result that they get to
They
uphold the
personally
Constitution.
want.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
they personally want, or they don't want their signature on it, so they find a way to rationalize it and like, here, circuit court, it's your problem, and if you overrule me, then I didn't make that decision. You guys did.
Gotcha.
I don't. I'd be lying to you if I told you I knew exactly what goes through some of these judges' heads, but if I had to venture a guess, I suspect that may be part of it here and there. Not to say that all of them do it. Some of them may very well believe that, hey, I considered everything put in front of me, and this is in fact the correct result, even if it is the wrong one.
Yeah, I always worry about judges being political appointees, but it is nice to see those rulings being made where they wouldn't have otherwise. My mind jumps up to Canada, which is basically the nightmare version of no political or judicial protections of any kind for the Second Amendment, in which now they're looking at a complete blanket ban of any magazine fed semi-auto. It's not great. It's not great. I followed after the original assault weapon ban, the federal order in council, essentially an executive order, and I remember the initial lawsuits, which were everything seemed like it was going in the favor. The law was sound. The witnesses for the defense, were terrible. The people that the government appointed to defend the ban on firearms and AR-15s and whatnot didn't know what the hell they were talking about. They just lied through their teeth the entire time. The gun rights organizations leading the lawsuit picked them apart, and it was honestly entertaining to watch. And the entire thing seemed like it was in the bag until the political appointee judge threw the entire thing out, citing several. And if you've ever shot a gun before, you'd be able to look at all of the statements and say, well, this is a lie, this is a lie, this is a lie. The entire case was thrown out, and the gun rights organizations were forced to pay the government for their legal expenses. And therein lies the problem, I think. A lot of judges, especially here, are, well, college-educated people from the city that were appointed by the standing government in the area. I don't quite know how it is in the States, but I imagine it's not too different. At least there's a degree of legal protection and precedent that needs to be followed, in theory.
Judges are people, right? So
Yeah.
we operate under a common law area of law, which means that basically judges are looking to the case law that happened before to reach the correct result in what they're doing.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, judges are people, and even those that want to do everything as impartial as possible are still human. So you're never going to get rid of that entirely. You brought up an interesting point about the evidence before him. So for the California assault weapons ban case, Miller versus Benitez, another SAF case, when I was at my former employer, I went out to the range and made a video shooting, demonstrating an AR-15 in a configuration that was unlawful in California, so collapsible buttstock, pistol grip, and a flash hider. And then
Shocking.
I took that same,
just unbelievably shocking.
Oh, think of the children.
I took that gun and I dropped on at the range a California compliant buttstock weird thing and a cap for the muzzle so that it didn't have a flash hider on it anymore. And the difference in the video, when the judge watched it, he just kind of, he expressed some doubts as to what the purpose of all these bans are. I mean, there's a lot of other things that led to that conclusion as well, but in video format, and one of the things I found is that putting stuff in front of in the form of video in front of judges is really helpful. Our bump stock litigation, we did the same thing. I went to the range with John from the Gun Collective, who I used to do the legal brief with, and we filmed a bump stock with a high-speed camera. And what was interesting about it was when we got to the circuit court, there was a judge she had to be in her 80s probably. It was amazing how that video helped her understand everything, because she wrote in the opinion, I watched the video and this is what I saw. And very clearly I could see that these were the things happening. So it's interesting, it's a tactic that I've found at least to be useful of demonstrating to judges, like, this is how the thing works or doesn't work.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm talking about shooting anyway.
Yeah. Well, that was something that was interesting with the Oregon hearing that I was a part of. The gentleman, the other witness for Gun Owners of America was a guy that ran a gun store in Oregon, and he was talking through, and the judge interjected a few times to ask for clarifications. The judge was genuinely interested in whether or not this guy was going to be able to get merchandise in the future. But part of it was the case, but it seemed like the judge was really interested, like, oh, and can they make a magazine this way? And he's like, no, none of their tooling is set up to make magazines this way. Like, the judge was genuinely interested in how this process worked and the effect. It seemed like beyond the scope of the case, beyond the scope of, his minimum required participation in making the ruling.
Yeah, there are some wicked smart judges out there, for sure. And I guess, Nathan, to circle back to the point you had about the political process or stuff, it depends as to whether they're political appointees or not. So all the federal judges are appointed by the president. In the states, I don't know how other states work, but in Pennsylvania, for instance, all of our judges are elected, which, brings about its own problems, right? Like, is it just you got your name in front of enough people, spend enough money, and now you're being put there, or do you actually possess like the skills required to do the job? So there's pros and cons to both approaches. I'm not sure. I'm not sold on either of them necessarily, but neither are very
the problem is the problem is there's going to be people involved in each way of doing it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Therein lies the problem.
People.
We found the bug in the system.
Yeah.
It's really a feature, I think, but
is there anything cool happening that you want to tell folks about that they can get involved with? I don't want to use the term plaintiff shopping, but if you would like to talk again about how useful plaintiffs are, and if anyone would like to participate in fighting for freedom.
We have a pretty young listener base, I want to say.
Exactly, yeah. Perhaps we can find a small collection of potential plaintiffs in different jurisdictions.
Yeah. Just saying, use the system to your advantage. I truly think that people who are actively invested, for example, in preserving rights or a particular special interest group, will be significantly better than just someone off the internet, who found something on Reddit. And that's kind of something I really like about how this culture is shaping. The people who are in it are generally, from my experience, true believers. Not to be weird and preachy about it, but I like that.
Yeah, so let me touch on that point real quick, and then we'll get to the plaintiffs in a second. So
yes,
I think it's important. I'll get there. I think that's an important point, right? Like I mentioned earlier, I turned 21 and bought a handgun, got my carry permit. I carry a gun. I go to the range and I shoot. I take training classes. I shoot a variety of different things. I shoot everything from defensive handgun and rifle stuff to trap and sporting clays. There's pretty much the whole gamut of things that I do. Love shooting with night vision. It's a good time. One of my favorite activities currently. But I think it's important. Like, I'm invested in this because me personally, like, this is a big part of my life, and it's something I care about from my own perspective. So of course I'm going to go out there and fight to the bitter end over trying to preserve that for not just myself, but everyone else. I don't know how it used to be. Certainly there are people that have been involved in the space over the years that I don't think, maybe they shoot guns every once in a while, but they're not as invested. So I would throw that out there. Like, I reload my own ammo as well. I got 4 presses down. I got 4 presses down in the basement. I used to manage a gun shop. I used to cast bullets. Like, I've kind of run through the different various areas. The only thing I haven't worked for is a major manufacturer yet. Who knows what the future holds? So I'm invested in this from a personal perspective, and as a result, like I'm going to go out there every day and do my best for everybody else because I want to see this right not only preserved but restored and potentially even expanded. I'm in it to win it, along with a lot of people out there. As far as the plaintiff stuff goes, there's a couple ways. Let's talk about litigation more broadly for a second. There's really two types. You have strategic litigation where you're sitting down, you're looking at the world, how it sits today, and you're saying, okay, this is how I'd like to shape it. And you're making a plan to advance that idea. The other way is somebody walks through the door and says, hey, I've got this problem. In this context, working for a nonprofit, I can't help everybody who comes through the door that says, hey, I've got a problem. But if your particular problem or the problem of somebody is one that there is a broader public benefit to going out and litigating that issue, we're interested. So to that end, on the website, I'd be remiss if I didn't plug it at least once. It's saf.org. There's a contact drop down. And there's a button for legal inquiries. You can just send anything over there. If there's something that's going on in your world that you might need help with, that you think there might be a broader public benefit to dealing with, drop us a line. We don't generally, as of right now, we're not really using social media to post that we're looking for plaintiffs for these kinds of cases. We're kind of working behind the scenes on that stuff. So it's a little hard for me to say, like, yeah, we're looking for plaintiffs for this thing. But certainly if you see a law coming that you suspect we might be interested in filing a lawsuit over, drop us a line. Hint, hint, Washington. We're on top. We're on top of that. But a couple people, showed up in the inbox totally unsolicited, and we contacted them because, like always, we're going to need plaintiffs. So those are kind of the big things for right now, anyways, to how people can help with that. Speaking of social media, we are on social media. We're getting more active on it. It was kind of something that was left off to the side that I want to invest a lot of energy in because I realize that, people my age, that's how we communicate. So that should be picking up here. We started on Friday with a new individual for that. The brand is going to get a little bit of a refresh here, hopefully in the very near future, as well as the website. So, it's hard to sell the organization sometimes to a little bit of a younger audience because they look and they say, kind of looks a little outdated and, what are you guys doing? Well, I assure you, we're doing a hell of a lot of work for you. And hopefully we'll be able to present the image that, is kind of eye-catchy and you guys go, oh yeah, want to be a part of that. So take a little bit of time, but we're getting there.
Yeah, and I hope that people don't get too cynical. That is something that has been a part of the gun community for a while, is the deep cynicism. And I think much more justifiable back, in my dad's days when Janet Reno was rolling up with the ATF all the time and legislation was going the wrong way. But there's a lot of folks doing really good work, and it really is encouraging to see the results. And so hopefully we can get beyond our own personal pessimism and cynicism and get engaged in the fight.
I agree entirely.
At the beginning.
Yeah.
The beginning of the process is where that's where you want to be. You don't want to be fighting at the end of the process. You want to get in the firstest with the mostest.
Yeah. I'm inclined to agree with that, and I will absolutely admit I'm very much guilty of that doomerism mentality. And as much as I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. But I've been known to say, just friggin' do it anyway. Put a stock on it. Who cares? Maybe don't post online, but wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But at the same time, I do think in the past I have been a little cynical in regards to, fighting for firearms rights in, the political or legal arenas. And I agree entirely with what Isaac has to say. I think it's important. I think it's a fight that's taking place on many fronts. And I think it's important to, while, it is a disheartening thing paying attention to all of them, I do think it shouldn't be shrugged off and ignored or laughed at like it has been in the past.
It's hard not to be a cynical person. particularly when it comes to this, particularly when you've seen years of just kind of being handed, a lot of losses and things like that. It's really easy to just shrug your shoulders. And, certainly there is a fight on the political front. Certainly there is a fight in the legal front. But I think the biggest place that there's a fight happening is the cultural front. And that's one
Yes,
that's not often
absolutely.
talked about. And I'm sure we could spend the next, hour and a half talking about the culture, and how important that is. But what I would say is, if you want to make a difference, you know, certainly donate. Research the group you're donating to. I'm not just going to plug SAF on this. What I would tell you is go look at the work they're doing, and if you think they're doing good work, go ahead and support them. You should probably, check and make sure that they're doing what they say they're doing. But, that's one way. You now have a proxy that's out there doing the things for you that you might not be able to do. But the one thing that everybody can do is they can engage in the cultural aspect of it. And even if it's just having a conversation with somebody, taking somebody out new to the range and showing them like, hey, look, all those things you heard about this stuff, it's not what they say it is. Any of that stuff is all net positive for firearms rights, and preserving that right that, we all hold so dearly. So I would say to the people that, I just can't afford to donate and things like that. Like, there are other things you can do in order to help effectuate change in a positive direction. So just don't ever forget that.
Yeah, for sure. Then I think that cultural thing is huge. I think it's a big part of the reason that we have so many of the wins on the other fronts today. It's pretty undeniable, that momentum, that snowball. So yeah.
My mind jumps back to what you were saying about, your family was for your entire life very anti-gun until you brought your dad to the range. And I've found immense success just bringing people who wouldn't have thought about it otherwise. Or, I try and make a point of bringing people who wouldn't have thought about it otherwise. And, not someone wearing a Punisher's skull baseball cap who drives a lifted Tacoma, but, people in the
Toyota
city.
bros are mad.
Yeah. But people who wouldn't agree with me, take them to go shoot a Chris Vector in the controlled environment for a little bit. Take them to go try some scary but fun and otherwise innocuous things. And I still have not had a situation where the person leaves anti-gun.
Yeah.
At worst, you don't change their mind and they're still a fence sitter.
Yeah. At best, you have someone who is, well, an ally in this particular thing. And I have found as well, the best case scenario is it isn't just about guns, and it's not just about gun rights. It starts them thinking about everything. Homeschooling, the ability to gather your own rainwater to give one very specific example.
Self-sufficiency is probably the way to describe it.
Yes.
Yeah. Contagious. Yeah.
Yeah. Once people start questioning and going, oh, well, everything that I've been told about this is a lie until now, they start to examine every aspect of their life. And it's not hard. It's really not hard with the rhetoric that you get from, CNN or anything else about firearms, and just how immensely wrong it is and how easy it is to disprove everything that's being said from, the White House, your local newspaper, anything. I find firearms are a really good gateway into almost everything else.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
I could go on about it for a long time, but then we'll just get into like another half-hour discussion about homeschooling.
Well, it is kind of fascinating. One of the things that we really love about being a holster company is it is possible to buy a gun and not really shoot it, not really think about the ramifications. But if you're interested in carrying a gun, that really kicks your responsibility thought process into high gear. You're thinking about carrying this thing. You're thinking about the responsibility of using it in public. You're thinking about what your actual sphere of responsibility is to protect others. Once you give somebody a holster that allows them to carry a gun every day, that really, really gets them, I think, on this really important track of thinking these things through. Because I know people that have a shotgun in the closet and it hasn't really forced them to think about self-reliance or the responsibilities that thing would entail. I've talked to people who bought a firearm when there were riots in their city, and then they sold it as soon as the riots were over. And but the nice thing about a holster is if you get somebody to cross that, that hurdle of actually carrying, all kinds of responsibilities loom up in your brain, and you start to think through those things and process them. And then I think it is pretty contagious. So yeah, holsters, they're not as exciting as you think, but we actually feel like they're really useful for the conversation.
Yeah, no, it really is.
They're like business cards for freedom.
Yeah, I think, and just exactly that. It's carrying a gun every day is also a pipeline into self-sufficiency. Once you take the safety of yourself and your family and others around you into your own hands, it just makes you really think about yourself as every aspect that you can be a responsible and self-sufficient individual. I still have my old sidecar V1, like very old. I love that thing. It probably smells like old cheese, but it's great. I love it. Not sponsored in any way by TREX Arms.
Nope. We don't do the sponsorship thing. We just come along and co-host on an ad hoc basis, apparently.
Kind of forced into the position. Isaac is now officially the new co-host. He will be here every week. You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen.
I heard it here first as well. We're in good company. Well, thank you so much, both of you. I really appreciate the opportunity to unknowingly co-host a podcast.
Anytime. Perhaps I should have been a little more specific in my wording, other than, "Hey, come on, help me! I don't know anything about politics or the law."
Well, I really appreciate an opportunity to talk to you, Adam. This has really been fascinating, and I love hearing more about kind of those early days and what Second Amendment Foundation is doing. Not being a lawyer, I have always been more interested, or it made more sense to get involved on the lobbying side. So that has definitely been where most of my attention has been. But post Bruen, not only has the landscape changed, but all of the work that came before that is worth delving into and understanding, so we can be more appreciative of it. So I really want to thank you. And Second Amendment Foundation has a great track record of doing this work and setting these things in motion.
Thank you guys both for coming on. Adam, genuinely, you and your organization do amazing work. I really recommend anyone listening to this to go check them out. I know this one was a little more like law heavy for a lot of the listeners, but I think that's important, and y'all can deal with it. It's my podcast and Isaac's.
I do have to ask, Adam, if you were to come back and talk about something just for fun, what would it be? Like, is there an avenue of the firearms world? You mentioned night vision, but is there something in particular that you would want to do just for funsies?
Yeah.
In the firearms world, or just generally?
Well, I would say just generally.
How about both? Let's make it harder.
Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, that one's certainly difficult. I mean, if we're talking about shooting stuff right now, certainly anything involving night vision and shooting with night vision has been. I like it more than shooting during the day. It's fun.
Yeah.
I'm very fortunate that there's a local club. So we're on the East Coast, and for some of you listening, you may be on the West Coast, and you guys have this stuff called BLM, where you could just show up anytime you want and shoot on it. We don't have that out here. We have to be members of ranges because everything's privately held here. And so for us to go shooting, I'm fortunate that there was a local club that started night shoots about 3 years ago, that it's really blossomed into something. I think the one it was supposed to be Saturday night, actually got canceled. We had some really bad weather. I ended up going to a friend's house where we were able to shoot anyway, but the range was a 25-yard range, small. It is what it is, but so being able to attend events like that here, and then when I go out west, I always bring my stuff. So like when I was out at the office last month, I hung out with the guys from Weapon Outfitters. We went shooting at night up in one of the forests up there. But as far as shooting stuff, right now, I think shooting with night vision is probably one of my favorite things. I still enjoy shooting clays a lot. As far as other things, I love cooking and I love backpacking. So every year I try to get out into the woods and do a 2 weeks of a trip, but incorporate at least a total of 7 or 8 days of backpacking into that trip. So Scouts, it taught me a lot of things, and backpacking was definitely one of the things that I took away from it. And of course, I wasted my college years by not doing that when it probably would have been a lot easier.
Yeah. I understand that intimately. But I think, and I'm not going to get into this more than just this one statement, because I will talk about it for ages. I think Scouts is one of the best things a young person can do, genuinely. I don't know if it's still like that, but a lot of my formative memories and basically my relationship with outdoors was founded by Scouts. It's great. It's fantastic.
A lot of life skills were learned in Scouts. That's, I went back to my troop. I sat on my troop committee for a little bit a couple of years ago before I just got too busy. I'm not sure about the program today, so this isn't an endorsement of it today, but it certainly helped. It helped me with a lot of skills that turned out to be very useful later in life, and certainly my affinity for the outdoors was definitely out of Scouts because that wasn't something my family did. So wouldn't trade it for the world.
Yeah, it's I was not a Scout, but I've been reading about how the organization was started and some of the goals, and it's actually pretty fascinating just how incredibly, for lack of a better word, militaristic it was. Like,
it's a paramilitary organization.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so Scouts were like the commandos of their day. So like if it were started in the, after World War II, it would have been called Boy Commandos. If it would have started today, it would be called Boy Special Forces. Like Boy Scouts was like, what's the coolest thing you can be in the military? This is for boys. They get to do it too. They get to do scouting and ranging and patrolling, and they wear uniforms that look like World War I doughboys. And Braden and Seaton and the guys that founded it were very much like of the old Indian fighter breed and other things that are extremely politically incorrect now. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah. I was a Scout here growing up, but I transitioned to cadets not too long after that, and I am really regretting it because cadets was essentially just Scouts except run by the government, and that came with everything bad about a program being run by the government.
There was a very different, I think, mentality back then. This idea that martial virtue was something that private citizens developed on their own. In case there was a war, then they would be ready. So teaching boys how to be a paramilitary organization prior to them being old enough to train for military service was a massive plus in everybody's eyes. Yeah. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Funny how times have changed.
God, I think actually I attributed that to some of my interest in firearms. Shooting I thought it was the coolest thing, a 12-shot Crosman pellet revolver at a bunch of pie plates when I was, I think, 11 or 12. But anyways, as we wrap this up, as it is getting fairly late for both of you, and I know you have an entire pack of dogs in your house somehow.
I do.
Before we wrap it up, for both of you, my lovely co-host Isaac here, and for Adam, some dad advice for our listeners.
Oh, dad advice. Oh, I have some good dad advice. One is pay attention to what the time zone is so you can schedule your podcast properly so you have time to put your kids to bed. That's a nugget.
Hey, I did check. I did say EST once, and then
it's entirely my fault.
That is on me.
It sounds like they're still wide awake. So the good news is I'm going to put to bed kids that are wide awake past their bedtime shortly. So all is well.
Sounds like a challenge I don't have. Oh man, Dad,
you've got dogs. It's the same thing.
Yeah, I guess let them.
Kind of. I've got a cat. I think it's the same thing. I mean, I tried homeschool her, but it doesn't go super well.
Well, there's one sack dad on the. No, she's looking at me now. I don't know. My advice would be let them out before you sit down to do a podcast. I don't know. I don't really. I'm trying to think of something sage that my dad's told me, but I'm not coming up with anything that's appropriate to share with your listeners. So I might have to forgo on the dad advice.
Oh, trust me. Anything you can say has been said on here.
Oh, I don't know about that. No, my dad's given me a lot of good advice over the years. But I'm struggling to think of anything off the top of my head. I'll take a rain check on this for the next time. Maybe I'll co-host with you in the future and give Isaac a break from his newfound job.
Genuinely, whenever you want, you're always open. If there's anything Second Amendment Foundation related you want to talk about, or even just want to shoot the shit and talk about something you're interested in, just give me a shout. I'm always around.
Sounds good.
I'm sometimes around. Yeah. Anyways, my dad advice, eat your broccoli and take people to the range, especially people you don't, who wouldn't otherwise like it or don't think that they like it. Generally, people's dislike of firearms doesn't last longer than the first couple of rounds. So I've brought this up before. Do your part. It's important.
Absolutely, yeah. On a serious note, a good piece of dad advice.
Yep.
Courage is a muscle. You got to exercise it before you need it, because it won't be there. You won't be as brave as you think you are when the emergency happens. You haven't been standing up for things ahead of time.
I like that a lot. Anyways, yeah. Okay, bye.